Before I get started, I just want to be abundantly clear that I do not think that temporary hit points should persist longer than the effects that provide them, and despite everything that I'm about to say, I will probably still run them as it worked in 2014, which was to end them with the effect that generated them. Alright? I just want to get this out of the way immediately. The point of this video, though, is about the discussion and the analysis of the various overlapping and intersecting rules, because I can assure everyone that it is a much more complicated and nuanced topic than you probably think that it is. So let's get our hands away from the dislike button for a minute and just have an unnecessarily deep discussion about fake health in a make-believe game. I implore you to just hear me out before reacting, because this is exactly the kind of video that I love to make. One that's overly analytical about a specific rule, and especially so when what I think the rule is directly contradicts with what I want that rule to be. So if I can put away my own bias, I think that we all can. Alright, so last week I posted a video where I did a tier list ranking every first level spell in the 2024 Player's Handbook. During the section on Armor of Agathys, I made a note about some potential quote-unquote bug or conflict with how temporary hit points might work within the context of the new books. And, as it turns out, that spawned a massive discussion in the comments of the video. Like, a solid 20% of them are just discussing it, and the rest are telling me that I got chromatic orb wrong, which I honestly kind of agree with, but that's not what this is about. Let's talk about temporary hit points in 2024 D&D. So for those who aren't in the know about what exactly I'm going on about, I should probably set the stage here. The question is, can temporary hit points persist beyond the effects that grant them? For example, if someone casts Polymorph, let's say on themselves, in 2024, Polymorph now grants temporary hit points equal to the creature's hit points. So if our caster then immediately decides to drop the spell, do they retain those temporary hit points, or do they vanish when the spell drops? Your immediate reaction is probably to say they disappear when the spell drops, and this was also my first thought, and again, it's how I think that it should be. But nevertheless, after far too much research into the topic and conversations and analysis, I feel very confident in saying that it is both rules as written and rules as intended from the designers at least, that hit points persist even after you drop Polymorph. That is to say that I don't think that they made a mistake. I think that they made an intentionally and frankly silly choice, but hear me out. In order to answer this question, the first thing that we need to check out are the rules for how temporary hit points work, obviously. In the 2024 PHB, we see that temporary hit points have been given a very specific duration, which reads, temporary hit points last until they are depleted, or you finish a long rest. On the face of it, this is very clear. It immediately suggests that the answer to our question is that yes, if you drop concentration on Polymorph, you still keep those hit points because you haven't finished a long rest and they haven't been depleted yet. The only potential thing this gets called into question is what exactly does depleted mean in this context? Are they depleted by the spell ending? I would say no, and it seems like the dictionary agrees with that assessment, as they aren't being used in any way. Okay, so we have a starting point, but here's the thing. This goes a lot deeper. This version of the temporary hit point rule that we have in 2024 has a significant omission from what we saw in 2014, and is another big part of why this question is popping up. In 2014, the rule read as follows: unless a feature that grants temporary hit points has a duration, they last until they're depleted or you finish a long rest. This, yet again, suggests that our initial interpretation of the 2024 rule is correct. The fact that they very specifically remove that first part of the rule that relates to features with a duration granting the temporary hit points heavily implies that they wanted to simply remove that element of the rule. Or did they? Here's the thing. The reason I say suggests and implies is because it's still not set in stone. Not every rule is written out every time that it might appear. The books would be like 50,000 pages long if they had to spell out every interaction every single time. Instead, they opt to do a few different things. If the rule and the interaction is spelled out somewhere else, they will often let us infer it from that, and then they'll also include in other rules where something might differ from the established ruling what exactly that differentiation is. A common example of this might include effects like Hypnotic Pattern, which imposes the charm condition, but then it goes on to say, while charmed in this way, because the charm imposed by Hypnotic Pattern is difficult from the typical way that the charm condition manifests itself in the game. Other examples that we see in the book itself are that attack rolls generally are made with strength or dexterity, but as we all know that there are plenty of other effects like the new True Strike which can change that. This is also where we see the specific beats general rule often come into play. So then the question becomes, do we have another instance of where temporary hit points are provided, but they specifically say how long it lasts for? Because if this is the case, it really helps us along the way to determining that our initial interpretation is correct. And it just so happens that we do. The third level Path of the World Tree Barbarian feature, Vitality of the Tree, has a sub-feature called Life-Giving Force. It's important to note that this feature allows the Barbarian to both gain and distribute temporary hit points. The very last line of Life-Giving Force reads as follows: if any of these temporary hit points remain when your rage ends, they vanish. While I certainly won't say that this is the nail in the coffin, it is definitely another step in the right direction toward finding out our answer and another piece of evidence to support our initial claim, that temporary hit points can persist beyond the effect that created them, because if they didn't, there would be no need for this line that tells us that our temporary hit points drop when our rage does. This is a great example of the specific beats general rule. The specific rule in the Vitality of the Tree feature establishes that if any of the temporary hit points that were generated by it remain when your rage ends, the temp HP go along with it rather than lasting until a long rest or until they're depleted. This also helps to confirm for us that depleted in the context used is not just a synonym for when the effect ends, as in a concentration spell or rage. It confirms that depleted means used. This case is also particularly important as it shows us that not all temporary hit points end when rage does, just these ones, which are the ones specifically provided for by the feature. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere, but we are still not done. Let's talk about the big elephant in the room and what just about everyone mentioned both in the video comments and on the poll I made: concentration. Just about every concentration spell in the 2024 Player's Handbook contains some variation of for the duration or until the spell ends, and then proceeds to describe what happens while the spell persists. Blade Ward is an incredibly simple example. Whenever a creature makes an attack roll against you before the spell ends, the attacker subtracts 1d4 from the attack roll. Alter Self. Choose one of the following options. Its effects last for the duration. Anti-Life Shell. An aura extends from you in a 10-foot emanation for the duration. These are all great and simple examples that help set us up for the next part of the discussion. The thing about concentration spells, though, is that many of them are far more complicated than the ones that I just mentioned, and they've got a lot of moving parts. One of the most commonly cited things that I saw in response to this question was some variation of, it's very clearly intended that all effects of concentration spells end when the concentration ends, unless the spell specifically says otherwise, or read the concentration rules. I can assure you that I have, and that it's nowhere near as clear-cut as many of these comments make it out to be. As mentioned earlier, basically every concentration spell has the qualifiers of for the duration or until the spell lasts or some iteration of it. Let's talk a bit more about concentration though. Firstly, here are the 2024 rules for concentration. The most relevant part here and what everyone is fixating on is the portion at the end of the first line where it says, if the effect's creator loses concentration, the effect ends. And to be honest, there is no arguing this. The effect of a concentration spell ends when the concentration ends. But this then calls into question what the effect of a concentration spell is. And that might sound like a stupid question, but it really isn't. Again, if it were implied that all effects of a concentration spell end when the spell ends, then those qualifiers about for the duration and so on do not need to be present at all. But they do, and this is because there are at least some effects that apply under concentration spells that are instantaneous in nature. This is important because instantaneous effects are, while created by magic, they're not sustained by it. I'll leave a link in the description to a Dragon Talks podcast episode where Jeremy Crawford goes in depth about Antimagic Field Spell, which, while not entirely related to what we're discussing, does have a reasonable amount of overlap. In case you don't feel like spending an hour watching it, the most important element here is just the point about instantaneous effects. Instantaneous effects are not sustained by magic, even if they are created by it. This is the exact reasoning why the undead raised by the Raise Dead spell would not wink out of existence in an anti-magic field. The spell is instantaneous. This is also exactly why hit points received from a healing spell like Cure Wounds or Healing Word aren't lost in an anti-magic field either. The spells are instantaneous. So why does this matter? It matters because instantaneous effects last until they're done, not until something else happens, and as mentioned, concentration spells have plenty of instantaneous effects. Consider literally any damage provided by any spell with concentration. That is an instantaneous effect. When concentration ends on Spike Growth or Spirit Guardians or Conjure Minor Elementals, for example, we don't reverse the damage that was done. The damage was dealt because despite these being concentration spells, they have an instantaneous component to them. This is also something that came up in some of the comments, and many pointed out that it would just be insane if the damage disappeared, and I agree, but they never really considered the why as far as the game is concerned. And this is the why. It's because the damage was dealt instantaneously despite it being potentially generated through a concentration spell. But there's more to this. The same is true of something like Aura of Life, which says that if an ally with 0 hit points starts his turn in the aura, the ally regains 1 hit point. Aura of Life is a concentration spell. When concentration ends, we're not rolling back any of those gained hit points. They keep them because they are instantaneous effects granted under a concentration spell. The aura is what's being concentrated on. The healing was ancillary to that. So in this case, this is why when the concentration ends on Aura of Life, the aura disappears, not the healing. And I know some of you will just say that healing and damage are different, and I would contend that they aren't really, it's just that they're instantaneous effects, which is probably not something that we really consider all the time. But to go one level deeper, here's another example. Consider any spell that knocks a creature prone, like Sleet Storm, Earthquake, or Tasha's Hideous Laughter. Affected creatures don't immediately spring back up when any of those spells end. They are given the prone condition and have it until they are successfully able to stand back up. Why? Because it was an instantaneous effect. In each of these spells, it isn't the knocking of the creature prone that's being concentrated on. In Sleet Storm, it's the cylinder. In Earthquake, it's the ground and the giant fissure that you're creating. In Hideous Laughter, it's the preventing of the creature from standing back up. Alongside all of those concentration effects, there are instantaneous ones that happen to coincide. Call Lightning is actually another good example that shows kind of a different side to this. The spell begins by saying that a storm cloud appears at a point within range, and that you can call down a lightning bolt to deal damage to a creature. An important distinction here is that concentration isn't really happening yet. Creating the cloud and damaging the first creature kinda happens instantaneously. Why the spell requires concentration only appears in the 3rd paragraph, where it reads, "Until the spell ends, you can use a magic action to call down lightning in that way again, targeting the same point or a different one." I would say that in this case, even when concentration ends, the storm cloud would probably still stay around because that wasn't the purpose of the concentration. It was the connection with the cloud to call down the lightning and deal damage that required the concentration. This is also confirmed in the final paragraph, where it says that you can just opt to use an existing storm cloud instead of creating one. Modify Memory is another example where the actual effect of the spell only even takes place once concentration has completed on it. Anyway, I know we're all kinda off topic here, but the intent is to truly highlight the fact that everyone's default line to kill this argument of the effect of a concentration spell ends when the spell ends is fundamentally untrue. There are plenty of effects, as have been shown, that persist well beyond the duration of the spell. Another thing that came up a lot was the idea that the specific rule of concentration supersedes the general rule of temporary hit points, and I'm not so sure about that one. Both concentration and temporary hit points are fairly general rules, but if anything, there are far fewer effects in the game that provide temporary hit points, so there's an argument to be made that it's the more specific one. But regardless, I think the sentiment is really that any given concentration spell, like Polymorph, is more specific than the general rule for temporary hit points, but I'm not really so sure about that either. Neither Polymorph, which we will get to shortly, or any other concentration spell that provides temporary hit points except for one, includes it in the section related to duration. The only exception is Heroism, but even that is pretty clear that the spell isn't sustaining those hit points in any way. It's just refreshing them. In this case, what is being concentrated on is the immunity to the frightened condition and the temporary hit point top up at the start of each turn, not just having temporary hit points. We know this because the creature can just lose them through damage and nothing happens to the spell. It's not sustaining those hit points in any way, it just gives them at defined intervals. Even Sage Advice has a direct answer to this where it confirms that the hit points are simply being refreshed by the spell. What I'm getting at is that if there's an element of the spell that can just go away and nothing else happens, there's a very high probability that that isn't what was being concentrated on. In the case of Heroism, if the caster loses concentration, the effect that's lost isn't the temporary hit points. The effect that drops is the immunity to being frightened and the ability to refresh those temporary hit points. Okay, so let's get back to Polymorph. It begins with a portion regarding duration. You attempt to transform a creature that you can see within range into a beast. The target must succeed on a wisdom saving throw or shapeshift into a beast form for the duration. It then carries on to describe what the forms of said beast can be, the ones that you can transform into for the duration. However, then in a separate paragraph, completely separated from the duration, is the following. The target gains a number of temporary hit points equal to the hit points of the beast form. The spell ends early on the target if it has no temporary hit points left. This to me, like any of the examples that I've gone over, is an ancillary and instantaneous effect that is granted by the spell and not sustained by it. Further support of this comes from the fact that you can even simply opt to not take the hit points, as is even defined in the temporary hit point rules themselves. Temporary hit points don't stack. Temporary hit points can't be added together. If you have temporary hit points and receive more of them, you decide whether to keep the ones you have or to gain the new ones. For example, if a spell grants you 12 temporary hit points when you already have 10, you can have 12 or 10, not 22. The fact that you can simply opt out of taking the temporary hit points in the first place, I honestly think cements the fact that this spell is not sustaining the temporary hit points. It's merely providing them as an instantaneous effect. It's an added bonus. In the other concentration spells where I mention what I feel the concentration is for, here's no different. Here, I believe the concentration is for maintaining the shapeshift, not the temporary hit points. Those just happen to be a potential bonus that you don't even need to take if you didn't want to for one reason or another. The only other concentration spells that allow you to kind of opt out of a portion of the spell are the ones that have instantaneous effects. You don't need to damage something with spike growth if nothing's in range. You don't need to heal something with aura of life if nothing is near you. This is basically that, just to yourself with temporary hit points. So with all that said, does any of this really matter? No, not particularly. Run it in your game however you want and whatever makes the most sense to you. Like I said earlier, I plan to revert to the old way and end the hit points when the effect that created them ends, but if that's not your jam, you can feel pretty well supported in the knowledge that the book, at least as currently written, kinda has your back. I think the only reason this has become a topic of discussion is because of how broken the potential with Polymorph is. It creates just so many essentially free hit points. And yes, I know, a 4th level spell slot is a fairly high opportunity cost and represents something else that you're not doing with that slot, but I still feel like it will often be worth it for the Polymorph cast. Honestly, I truly do hope that we eventually get some official clarity on this, and if the way that I've outlined here is not how it's intended to work, I do hope that we get an errata to make that abundantly clear, because despite what some are saying, it's really quite complicated. So that's all I got. Let me know what you think in the comments below and try to keep it tame. Again, remember this is all about the discussion and the analysis. If you think I'm wrong, that's totally fine. There's a high probability that I am, and I'd love to talk about it. So check out some of my other D&D videos, but otherwise, take care.